Blood trickled down her temple as Sarah fled into the desert, leaving behind a world of fists and broken promises. The morning sun revealed her desperate tracks in the sand, a stumbling path toward nowhere. Miles away, Gojo paused in his morning prayer, troubled by a vision of a wounded dove. Following ancient wisdom passed down through generations, he gathered his medicine pouch and set out to track this stranger who had wandered into sacred lands. What he found was a woman balanced on the edge of a vast canyon, her eyes as empty as the void below. Would the old ways be enough to heal what modern cruelty had broken? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weight of the bent gold band on Sarah's finger had long ceased to represent love. As she stumbled through the shifting sands, each ragged breath brought flashes of the night before. Thomas's face contorted with rage, the shattering glass, his fists. 18 years of marriage had dissolved into a ritual of bruises hidden beneath high collars and excuses whispered to concerned neighbors. "He works so hard for us," she had told Mrs. Caldwell just last week, adjusting her shawl to cover the purple fingerprints on her neck. "The mining business takes its toll." Thomas Reed was respected in Copper Springs. His silver mine employed half the men in town, and his donations had built the church where Sarah sat every Sunday, praying for deliverance while the pastor praised her husband's generosity. No one questioned why the mine owner's wife flinched at sudden movements or why her smile never reached her eyes. Last night had been different. Thomas had returned home reeking of whiskey and rage, his business ledger clutched in his hand. "You've been stealing from me," he had accused, though Sarah had never touched his money. The first blow came before she could respond. When she woke on the kitchen floor, blood pooling beneath her head, she knew she would die if she stayed. She had taken nothing but her shawl and the clothes on her back, slipping out while Thomas snored upstairs. Now the desert sun beat down mercilessly and her swollen lips cracked with thirst. Sarah had no plan beyond escape, no destination, no allies waiting. At 43, with no family and nowhere to turn, the vast emptiness of the desert seemed her only refuge. Hours passed in a haze of heat and pain. Her temple throbbed where it had struck the kitchen table. Each step became more difficult than the last as the sand pulled at her impractical town shoes. Still she pressed on, driven by the certainty that death in this wilderness would be kinder than one at her husband's hands. By midday, the distant shimmer of rocks had transformed into the reality of a massive canyon cutting across her path. Sarah stood at its edge, swaying slightly as vertigo gripped her. The drop was dizzying, hundreds of feet down to where a thin ribbon of water caught the sunlight. The obstacle seemed insurmountable in her weakened state. She sank to her knees, the last of her strength evaporating like morning dew. Perhaps this was as far as she was meant to go. As consciousness began to slip away, Sarah thought she felt eyes watching her from the scrubby vegetation nearby. She was too exhausted to feel fear. What more could happen to her now? Her wedding ring caught the sunlight as her hand fell limply to her side. The band was bent from the last time Thomas had grabbed her wrist, the gold warped like the promises they had once exchanged. It had been easier to bend the metal than to break her spirit, but now, as darkness crept into the edges of her vision, Sarah wondered if both had finally reached their breaking point. The last thing she saw before collapsing was a hawk circling overhead, its freedom mocking her earthbound suffering. Then there was only darkness, blessed and complete. Gojo knelt upon the red earth as the first light of dawn brushed the eastern horizon. At 52 winters, his face was a map of deep lines carved by sun and experience. The small medicine pouch around his neck contained objects of power collected over decades: a hawk's feather, a piece of turquoise, herbs wrapped in buckskin, and a small carved stone passed down through generations of healers. His morning prayers were interrupted by a vision that came unbidden. a wounded dove with crimson droplets staining white feathers, struggling across burning sand. The image was so vivid that Gojo opened his eyes, half expecting to see the bird before him. Instead, he faced only the familiar landscape of his people's summer encampment. "The spirits speak to you again, brother?" Old man Nakai approached, silently, his weathered hand resting on Gojo's shoulder. "A woman walks in the desert," Gojo replied. "She bleeds and carries great pain." Nakai's expression hardened. "A white woman. This is not our concern." "Pain knows no color," Gojo countered, rising to his feet. "The spirits showed her to me for a purpose." The old man shook his head. "Your heart was always too soft. The white people bring nothing but trouble. If their women suffer, it is not for us to mend." Gojo touched his medicine pouch. "My grandfather taught me that healing is a sacred duty. I cannot turn away. You risk much for strangers," Nakai warned. "Remember what happened to your sister when she trusted white men." The painful memory threatened to surface, but Gojo pushed it down. "This is different. I am called to help, not to trust." Without waiting for further argument, he returned to his dwelling and began preparations. He filled his water gourd from the spring, selected healing herbs from his carefully dried collection, and packed enough jerky to sustain him for several days. Last, he retrieved his tracking kit, a small bundle containing tools honed through decades of following game through the most difficult terrain. Gojo's reputation as a tracker was unmatched within the tribe. From childhood, he had shown an uncanny ability to read the stories written in disturbed soil, bent grass, and scattered pebbles. This gift, combined with his healing knowledge, had earned him respect, even from those who found him too accepting of the changing world beyond. Their territory, he left camp as the sun cleared the horizon, following an invisible path that only he could sense. The spirits rarely gave such clear visions, and he would not ignore their guidance. For hours, he traveled swiftly through arroyos and across mesas, reading the desert's secrets. By midday, he found what he sought: footprints in the sand, small and uneven, showing a stumbling gait. The tracks were fresh, perhaps only hours old. Whoever made them was weakening with each step. Gojo quickened his pace. The trail led toward the Great Canyon, a dangerous place for anyone unfamiliar with its treacherous edges and hidden paths. As he approached, something white caught his eye against the red earth. A figure crumpled at the canyon's edge. He approached cautiously, noting the woman's fine dress now torn and dirty, the blood matted in her hair. Her skin was angry red from sun exposure, her breathing shallow and rapid. This was no desert traveler equipped for the journey, but someone fleeing in desperate haste. Gojo knelt beside her, checking for signs of life. Though unconscious, she lived. The vision had not led him astray. In her unconscious state, she looked older than he first thought, perhaps 40 winters, with streaks of grey in her dark hair. Bruises in various stages of healing marked her exposed skin, telling a story Gojo understood too well. Whatever had driven her into the desert had been no single act of violence, but a long journey of suffering. Gojo touched his medicine pouch and whispered a prayer of protection. The dying day would bring cold, and the woman would not survive the night without help. The Great Canyon stretched before them, an impassable barrier to most, but not to one who knew its secrets. Consciousness returned to Sarah like a reluctant tide, bringing with it the sharp renewal of pain. Something cool touched her parched lips. Water. She drank greedily, choking in her desperation. Slowly, a deep voice cautioned. Sarah's eyes flew open, terror replacing thirst as she scrambled backward. Before her knelt an Apache man, his long hair streaked with silver, face weathered by decades of sun. Every horror story she had ever heard about savage Indians flooded her mind. "No," she gasped, raising her hands defensively. "Please, no." The man remained motionless, holding out the water gourd. His expression showed neither threat nor anger, only patient concern. He spoke words she couldn't understand, his tone gentle. For long moments they remained locked in this tableau, the frightened white woman and the Apache healer. Sarah's racing heart gradually slowed as she realized that if he had meant her harm, he could have done so while she was unconscious. He gestured again with the water gourd. This time Sarah accepted it with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered. The man nodded, then pointed to himself. "Gojo! Gojo!" she repeated clumsily. He touched her shoulder. "Hash Yiji?" When she only stared in confusion, he pointed more directly at her. "Sarah," she said, understanding dawning. "My name is Sarah Reed." The moment her married name left her lips, she flinched, as though Thomas might somehow hear her from across the desert. Gojo noticed her reaction. His dark eyes missed nothing, cataloguing her injuries with professional assessment. He reached toward her temple, then paused, waiting for permission. When Sarah nodded hesitantly, his fingers gently probed the wound where Thomas's ring had cut her. His disapproving click of the tongue needed no translation. From a small pouch at his waist, he produced a handful of crushed leaves, spat into them, and mixed the paste with his finger. Sarah recoiled slightly as he applied the mixture to her temple, but the immediate cooling sensation eased her discomfort. As he worked, Gózhő studied the woman before him. Her fine, though tattered dress spoke of wealth, while the pattern of her injuries told of prolonged abuse. The bruises were too methodical to be accidental, too precisely placed to be anything but intentional. He'd seen such marks before, on women from his own tribe who had suffered at the hands of cruel husbands. The canyon shadows were lengthening rapidly. Gózhő looked toward the sun, then made a sleeping gesture, pointing to the darkening sky. Sarah followed his gaze, suddenly aware that night was approaching. The desert's scorching heat would soon transform into bone-chilling cold, and she had no shelter, no blanket, nothing to protect her from the elements. Gózhő pointed across the canyon, then to a distant plateau beyond. He spoke at length, gesturing to indicate what Sarah assumed was his home. He pointed to her, made walking motions with his fingers, then shook his head. Sarah understood. She was too weak to make such a journey. Then he pointed to himself, then to her, and mimed carrying something. "You want to carry me?" Sarah asked, incredulous. Gózhő nodded, pointing again to the dangerous canyon, then to the darkening sky. The message was clear. They couldn't stay here, and she couldn't make the crossing alone. Sarah hesitated, putting herself completely in the power of a stranger, an Apache man no less, went against everything she had been taught. Yet what choice did she have? Stay and surely die from exposure, or trust this man who had already shown her kindness? Gózhő seemed to understand her internal struggle. He held out his water gourd again, this simple offering, a testament to his intentions. The weathered hands that offered life-giving water showed no threat, only capability and strength. Sarah looked into his eyes and saw something she recognized: compassion without pity, strength without cruelty. How strange to find such humanity here, in the person she had been taught to fear, after fleeing from the man she had vowed to love. Sarah nodded her consent, and Gózhő wasted no time. The sun was sinking rapidly, painting the canyon walls in deepening shades of orange and red. He gestured for her to drink more water, then secured his medicine pouch and other supplies. With surprising gentleness for his weathered appearance, Gózhő lifted Sarah into his arms. She was lighter than he expected. Too light, speaking. Of meals missed and strength depleted long before her desert journey began. Her body tensed at his touch, then gradually relaxed as he adjusted her weight securely against his chest. The path Gózhő chose was invisible to untrained eyes, a narrow ledge that wound downward along the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a single person. As they began their descent, Sarah's fingers clutched the rough fabric of his shirt, her face pressed against his shoulder to avoid looking at the dizzying drop beside them. "Do na adaditsa ida," Gózhő murmured, his deep voice beginning, a rhythmic chant that seemed to match his careful footsteps. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, the steady cadence had a calming effect, giving her something to focus on besides their precarious position. The ancient water songs of his people had guided many across dangerous terrain. Each verse honored the spirits of the canyon, asking safe passage in exchange for respect. Gojo had learned these chants as a boy, sitting at his grandfather's feet, never imagining he would one day sing them while carrying a white woman through sacred lands. Halfway down the canyon wall, a section of the path had crumbled away, leaving a gap of nearly 3 feet. Gojo paused, considering their options. To turn back would mean certain death for the woman. To proceed required a leap of faith with precious cargo. Sarah felt his hesitation and raised her head. Seeing the gap, she inhaled sharply. "We can't cross that," she whispered. Gojo met her eyes and nodded once, his expression calm but serious. He spoke a few words she couldn't understand, then shifted her weight slightly. His intent was clear. He would jump with her in his arms. "No," Sarah protested. "Put me down. I'll find another way." Ignoring her objections, Gojo took several steps back, his muscles tensing in preparation. Sarah closed her eyes, burying her face against his neck. In that moment, she had no choice but to trust him completely, her life literally in his hands. Gojo's leap was powerful and precise. For a breathless moment, they were suspended above the abyss, the canyon floor, hundreds of feet below. Then his feet struck solid ground, stones skittering away from the impact. He staggered slightly, but maintained his balance and his grip on Sarah. The chant resumed, perhaps with a note of gratitude added to its rhythm. As they continued downward, an eagle soared overhead, its cry echoing against the canyon walls. Single feather drifted down, landing on the path before them. Without breaking stride, Gojo bent to retrieve it, tucking it carefully into his belt, a gift from the spirits, a sign of approval. By the time they reached the canyon floor, twilight had deepened into dusk. A shallow river flowed between worn stones, its music a counterpoint to Gojo's now softened chanting. He paused to let Sarah drink from the clear water, supporting her head as she bent forward in his arms. The ascent up the opposite wall followed a different path, wider, in places but steeper. Gojo's breathing grew more labored, yet his steps never faltered. Sarah marveled at his strength and endurance, carrying her weight as darkness fell around them. Stars emerged in the indigo sky by the time they reached the canyon's far rim. Gojo finally set Sarah down on a flat stone, allowing himself a moment's rest. His weathered face gleamed with sweat in the starlight, but his eyes showed satisfaction rather than exhaustion. Sarah looked back at the crossing they had made, now just a dark void in the night landscape. What had seemed an insurmountable barrier hours ago had been conquered through this man's skill and strength. For the first time since fleeing her home, a fragile sense of safety began to blossom within her. Gojo retrieved the eagle feather from his belt, offering it to her with a simple gesture that needed no translation, a token of protection for the journey ahead. Gojo gathered Sarah into his arms once more and continued away from the canyon rim. The moonlight revealed a landscape of twisted junipers and ancient stones, unlike anything Sarah had seen from her town. Though exhausted, she forced herself to remain alert, trying to memorize landmarks, an instinct born from years of planning escape routes in her own home. After traversing a narrow path between towering rock formations, they arrived at a small, nearly invisible opening in the cliff face. Gojo ducked inside, carrying Sarah into darkness that gradually revealed itself as a cave. He set her down gently on a sandy floor, then moved with practiced familiarity to a small pile of supplies, evidence that this place was known to him, perhaps a way station for hunters or travelers of his tribe. From a hidden cache, he produced a small bundle of wood and dried brush. With deft movements, he created a fire, its warm light spreading through the cave and revealing its secrets. Sarah gasped softly as the flames illuminated the walls around them. Ancient paintings covered the rock surface, handprints in red ochre, stick figures hunting deer, spiral patterns, and symbols whose meanings she couldn't begin to guess. Some looked as though they had been painted yesterday, others were faded by countless centuries. The firelight made them seem to move, as though the hunters eternally chased their prey across stone canvases. Gojo watched her reaction with quiet approval. Few white people ever saw these sacred places. That she showed wonder rather than dismissal spoke well of her spirit. "Beautiful," Sarah whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the cave. Gojo nodded, then gestured to a specific panel of paintings. "Diin," he said solemnly, touching his medicine pouch. The images showed human figures with raised hands surrounded by plants and what appeared to be floating spirits, a healing ceremony captured in pigment centuries ago. The fire established, Gojo turned his attention to Sarah's injuries. With gentle but efficient hands, he examined the cut on her temple, the bruises on her arms, the raw blisters on her feet from walking in unsuitable shoes. From his medicine pouch, he produced various herbs and pouches. He chewed some leaves into a paste, applying it to her temple. Another mixture, combined with water, became a salve for her blistered feet. Each application was accompanied by soft murmurs in his own language, not quite chanting, but words that seemed to hold power. Nonetheless, though the pain remained, Sarah felt a cooling sensation spread from each treated area. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. "My name is Sarah Winters." The use of her maiden name was deliberate, a small reclamation of self. Gojo smiled slightly, repeating, "Sarah." His pronunciation made it sound different, almost musical. With movements that telegraphed his intentions, he offered her strips of dried meat from his supplies. Sarah hadn't realized how desperately hungry she was until the first taste touched her tongue. She forced herself to eat slowly, knowing that too much too quickly would make her ill. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Sarah's exhaustion became overwhelming. Gojo arranged his blanket to create a pallet for her, gesturing that she should rest. He would keep watch from near the cave entrance. But as Sarah drifted toward sleep, fragments of memory invaded her peace. Thomas's voice, his fists, the sound of breaking glass. She moaned softly, trapped between wakefulness and nightmare. From his position by the entrance, Gojo began to sing. Not the rhythmic chanting of their canyon crossing, but something gentler. The melody wove through the cave like smoke, wrapping around the ancient paintings and Sarah's troubled dreams alike. The words were foreign, but the sentiment transcended language. A healing song, passed down through generations of medicine. As it filled the sacred space, Sarah's breathing gradually steadied. The song spoke of desert blooms after rainfall, of eagles riding thermal currents, of strength found in the darkest times. Sarah surrendered to sleep, her dreams now filled with canyon winds and eagle feathers rather than violent hands. Throughout the night, Gojo maintained his vigil, occasionally adding small branches to the fire, his soft singing continuing until the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky. Dawn painted the desert in hues of gold and rose, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost ethereal. Sarah woke to find Gojo already awake, tending a small fire at the cave entrance. The herbal treatments had worked their magic overnight. Her temple throbbed less, and the raw feeling of her blistered feet had dulled to a manageable ache. When he saw she was awake, Gojo offered water and more dried meat. As Sarah ate, he pantomimed walking, then pointed eastward, raising his eyebrows in question. "Yes," she nodded. "I can travel." The bruises mottling her skin told a different story. But Sarah had spent years hiding pain. The alternative, remaining in this cave while Thomas potentially searched for her, was unthinkable. They set out as the day's heat began to build, Sarah walking slowly but under her own power. Gojo adjusted his pace to hers, occasionally steadying her with a respectful hand at her elbow when the terrain grew challenging. He led her through a labyrinth of narrow passes between towering rock formations, following a path invisible to untrained eyes. After an hour's journey, the red rock suddenly gave way to an unexpected sight. Nestled within a protective semicircle of cliffs lay a small oasis, a spring-fed pool surrounded by lush vegetation that seemed miraculous after the barren landscape they'd traversed. "Toe," Gojo said, gesturing to the clear water. "Water, toe," Sarah repeated, the unfamiliar syllable awkward on her tongue. Gojo smiled, the first full smile she'd seen from him. The expression transformed his weathered face, revealing a warmth that transcended their language barrier. He led her to the pool's edge, where he removed a small clay bowl from his pack. Kneeling, he filled it with water, then added herbs from his medicine pouch. He offered the bowl to Sarah, pantomiming drinking. The liquid was bitter but refreshing, leaving a cooling sensation in her throat. Medicinal, Sarah realized. Something to continue her healing from within. Using gestures and the few shared words they'd established, Gojo conveyed that she should bathe in the spring. He indicated he would stand watch at a respectful distance. His back turned to give her privacy. Sarah hesitated only briefly. The thought of washing away days of sweat and fear was too tempting to resist. Once sure of his discretion, she removed her tattered dress and slipped into the pool. The water was surprisingly warm, fed by some underground thermal source. As she submerged herself, the mineral-rich water seemed to draw the ache from her muscles and the heat from her sunburned skin. Gojo had left a small bundle of yucca root at the water's edge. Sarah recognized it from her own knowledge of frontier remedies. When crushed and wet, it created a soapy lather. The familiar practice in this unfamiliar place brought unexpected comfort. After washing, Sarah reluctantly donned her dirty dress, wishing for clean clothes. Gojo returned with something in his hands, a simple garment of soft buckskin, clearly a woman's dress from his tribe. He offered it without expectation, merely extending an option. Sarah accepted gratefully, disappearing. Behind a stand of reeds to change, the dress was surprisingly comfortable, if unfamiliar in its style. She emerged feeling transformed, her old clothing bundled in her arms. Gojo had prepared a simple meal of roasted desert roots and cactus fruit. As they ate in companionable silence, Sarah studied her surroundings more carefully. The hidden springs seemed untouched by the outside world, a secret garden known only to those whom the desert trusted with its mysteries. "Gojo," she said, testing her pronunciation of his name. When he looked up, she touched her chest. "Sarah." He nodded, then touched his own chest. "Gojo, he sees," she repeated, understanding it was a translation of his name. He pointed to her, Sarah, then made a questioning gesture. Understanding he wanted to know the meaning of her name, she smiled sadly. "Princess," she said, the irony not lost on her. Nothing in her life had been remotely royal. From the spring's edge, Gojo collected more water in a clay bowl, setting it aside. Sarah recognized it as a practical measure for their continued journey, but there was something ceremonial in his careful handling of the vessel, as though the water itself was sacred. As they prepared to continue their journey, Sarah glanced back at the oasis. She suddenly realized that no pursuit would find them here. This place existed beyond the maps and knowledge of men like Thomas. For the first time since fleeing, she allowed herself to believe she might truly escape. Thomas Reed stood at the edge of his property, watching as the 3 men he'd hired examined the ground near the back fence. His knuckles still bore the cuts from 2 nights ago, when Sarah had finally pushed him too far with her constant nagging about the mine's accounts. If she'd just left well enough alone, none of this would have happened. "Got something here, Mr. Reed," called Martinez, the best tracker in the territory. The Mexican had an almost supernatural ability to read sign, a skill Thomas was paying handsomely for. "She went this way, into the desert." "That's suicide," said Sheriff Dawson, fingering. his badge nervously. Thomas had pulled him from a card game at the saloon, insisting he organize a search party for his missing wife. The sheriff knew better than to ask about the blood on the kitchen floor. "She's not thinking clearly," Thomas explained smoothly. "Hit her head in a fall. I'm worried sick about her condition." The third man, Blackwood, a cattle driver who occasionally worked as a bounty hunter, spat tobacco juice onto the sand. "Ain't nobody survived more'n 2 days out there without water and supplies." Thomas removed a brass telescope from his saddlebag, extending it to scan the horizon. "Then we'd better find her quickly, hadn't we?" The telescope had been a gift from Sarah on their 5th anniversary before she'd become so difficult. The irony of using it to hunt her now wasn't lost on him. Through its brass cylinder, the vast emptiness of the desert seemed to mock his search. For 2 days, they followed Sarah's increasingly erratic trail. The signs of her weakening were clear: scuffed footprints, places where she had fallen, moments where she had wandered in circles. "She was in a bad way here," Martinez observed on the 3rd morning, crouching to examine tracks that were rapidly disappearing under the desert wind's relentless scouring. "Not long for this world, I'd say." "We keep looking," Thomas insisted. "I want to find her dead or alive." The sheriff raised an eyebrow at this, but said nothing. His participation was reluctant at best, motivated by the $50 Thomas had pressed into his palm. By mid-afternoon, they reached the canyon's edge where Sarah's tracks ended abruptly. "She might have fallen," Blackwood suggested, peering over. "The edge." Martinez shook his head. "No, look here." He pointed to new tracks overlapping Sarah's. "Someone found her, Apache, from the moccasin print." Thomas felt rage boiling up inside him. "Are you telling me some filthy Apache has my wife?" The tracker nodded, his expression neutral. "Good tracker, too. Knew what he was looking for, came straight to her." "If Injun's got her, she's dead anyway," the sheriff said, clearly ready to abandon the search, or worse. "We follow," Thomas declared, his tone brooking no argument. "How do we get across this canyon?" Martinez studied the edge carefully. "There's a path down, but it's too narrow for horses. We'd have to go 10 miles south to the crossing." "Then that's what we'll do," Thomas snapped. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Now hold on, Thomas. We're talking about entering Apache territory. That's beyond my jurisdiction and, frankly, beyond common sense." "I'll pay double," Thomas said flatly. Blackwood spat again. "Ain't about money. Them Apaches catch us on their land. Won't be enough left of us to bury." Thomas leveled a cold stare at the men. "My wife has been abducted by savages. You expect me to simply accept that?" "Your wife fled into the desert to escape you," Martinez said quietly, meeting Thomas's gaze without flinching. "The Apache who found her likely saved her life." Thomas's hand moved to his pistol. "Watch your mouth, Mexican." The sheriff stepped between them. "Easy now. We're all tired. Let's make camp and discuss this rationally." Later, as the desert night enveloped them in cold darkness, Thomas sat apart from the others, staring into the fire. He had invested too, much in Sarah to let her go now. 18 years of molding her, controlling her, ensuring her obedience. The thought of her finding freedom, perhaps even happiness without him, was intolerable. He raised the brass telescope again, though there was nothing to see but stars. Tomorrow they would find the crossing. If the sheriff and Blackwood lacked the stomach for it, he and Martinez would continue alone. Thomas had connections in the territorial government who would overlook a small incursion into Apache land to recover a white woman. One way or another, he would find Sarah, and when he did, he would ensure she never ran again. By midday, Sarah caught glimpses of smoke rising above distant trees, signals that civilization of some form lay ahead. After 2 more days of careful travel through terrain that seemed designed to confuse outsiders, they crested a rise overlooking a hidden valley. Below, nestled against a cliff face with a small stream running nearby, stood the Apache summer encampment. Conical wickiups made of brush and hides formed a loose circle around a central clearing. Women worked at cooking fires or scraped hides. stretched on frames. Children darted between dwellings, engaged in some game involving sticks and hoops. Men sat in groups, crafting weapons or talking in low voices. The peaceful scene contrasted sharply with the savage imagery Sarah had been raised to believe. These were families living their lives, not the war-painted marauders from dime novels and newspaper headlines. Her steps faltered nonetheless. Would they welcome her, or see only an unwanted intruder from the people who threatened their way of life? Gózhő sensed her hesitation and placed a reassuring hand briefly on her shoulder. Then he led the way down the slope toward the encampment. Their approach did not go unnoticed. Activity ceased as heads turned in their direction. Children were quickly gathered by watchful mothers. Men rose, some reaching for weapons with practiced ease. An elderly man emerged from the largest wickiup, his silver hair adorned with feathers, his bearing regal despite his advanced years. Beside him walked a woman of similar age, her face a tapestry of deep lines that spoke of wisdom earned through decades. Gózhő stepped forward, leaving Sarah a few paces behind. He addressed the elders in their shared language, his tone respectful, but firm. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, she recognized when the conversation turned to her. Eyes darted in her direction, expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. The elderly woman approached Sarah, studying her with penetrating eyes that missed nothing, the healing cut at her temple, the fading bruises on her arms, the way she unconsciously hunched her shoulders in a protective gesture, learned through years of abuse. "Shiaji," the woman said softly, touching her own chest. "Nijoni." "Nijoni," Sarah repeated carefully, understanding this was the woman's name. Nijoni turned to the others, speaking rapidly. Whatever she said caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere. While suspicion remained, the immediate tension eased. Slightly, Gózhő returned to Sarah's side. "Nakai-sani," he said, pointing to the elderly man. "Chief, wise man." The chief approached, his gaze stern but not unkind. He spoke directly to Sarah, though she couldn't understand. "He asks why you come to our land," Gózhő translated haltingly, using the few English words he knew combined with gestures. Sarah touched her bruised face, then made a fist and struck her own palm, before pointing eastward toward the town she had fled. The universal language of violence needed no translator. The chief nodded slowly, comprehension in his eyes. Many of their own women had suffered at the hands of white soldiers and settlers. Violence against the vulnerable was a language that crossed all cultural boundaries. A young woman approached, carrying a ceremonial blanket of intricate design. At the chief's nod, she draped it around Sarah's shoulders. The gesture wasn't merely practical. It carried meaning that Sarah sensed without understanding. A conditional acceptance, perhaps, or protection extended temporarily. "Ahehe," Sarah said, recalling the word of thanks she had heard Gózhő use at the spring. Her pronunciation must have been passable, for several women smiled slightly. One young mother shifted her baby to her hip and approached, touching Sarah's hair with curious fingers. The simple human contact, offered without fear or judgment, brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. Nijoni spoke again, gesturing toward a smaller wickiup at the edge of the encampment. Gózhő explained through gestures that Sarah would stay there while healing. As the Apache returned to their activities, Sarah remained wrapped in the ceremonial blanket, watching the life of the camp resume around her. She caught fragments of conversation, her name mentioned with tones of curiosity or concern. Some glances still held suspicion, others assessment, a few even sympathy. She was an outsider granted temporary sanctuary, her presence both a disruption and, judging from the protective stance Gózhő maintained nearby, potentially a new complication. For the tribe's delicate relationship with the white world beyond their valley, days melted into a week, then two. Sarah's bruises faded from angry purple to yellow-green, then disappeared altogether, her body healing faster than her spirit. The small wickiup at the camp's edge became her sanctuary, a place to retreat when the stares of curious children or suspicious warriors became too intense. Nijoni visited daily, bringing food and patience in equal measure. The elderly woman had appointed herself Sarah's teacher, using a combination of gestures, objects, and repeated words to build a bridge between their languages. Sarah proved an apt pupil, her mind hungry for this new knowledge after years of Thomas dismissing her intelligence as unnecessary in a wife. It was during one such lesson that Sarah first revealed her past to Nijoni. "I was a midwife," she explained, pantomiming a woman giving birth, then cradling a baby. "Before Thomas, my husband, before he forbade it." Nijoni's weathered face showed instant understanding. She disappeared into her own dwelling, returning with a collection of herbs, roots, and powders in small hide pouches. One by one, she named them in Apache, demonstrating their uses. This one for fever, that for bleeding, another for pain. Sarah's eyes widened with recognition. "I know this one," she said, holding up a dried plant. "We call it yarrow." She mimicked using it to stop bleeding, and Nijoni nodded with approval. From that day forward, their lessons centered on medicine. Nijoni introduced Sarah to the tribe's 3 most skilled healers, women whose knowledge had been passed down through generations. Despite the language barrier, Sarah's prior experience as a midwife created an immediate connection. Gojo watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. Though his duties often took him away from camp, hunting, scouting, gathering specific medicinal plants from distant locations, he made time each evening to check on Sarah's progress. Their conversations, once limited to gestures and a few shared words, grew increasingly complex as Sarah's vocabulary expanded. "Why did you become a healer?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat outside her wickiup, the sunset painting the cliffs behind the camp in brilliant orange. Gojo considered the question, searching for words she would understand. "As boy, I sick," he explained in halting English. "Many moons near death, old medicine man save me. I learn his ways to thank spirits." Sarah nodded, understanding both his words and the deeper commitment they represented. She had made a similar promise as a young woman after a midwife had saved her mother during a difficult birth. One morning, Sarah discovered a small, leather-bound journal and pencil left outside her dwelling, a gift from Gojo, who had traded for them on a rare visit to a distant trading post. The pages were blank, waiting for her knowledge. That night, she began recording what she had learned. Apache words for various plants, their medicinal properties, preparation methods. Where Apache and frontier medicine overlapped, she noted the similarities. Where they differed, she carefully documented both approaches. The journal became her constant companion. When she accompanied the women into the hills to gather plants, she sketched the leaves and roots. When Nijoni demonstrated how to prepare a poultice for chest congestion, Sarah recorded each step. When Gojo showed her how certain barks could be brewed into teas for various ailments, she noted the subtle differences in preparation. Not everyone in the tribe approved of this sharing of knowledge. Some elders watched with disapproving eyes as Sarah's integration deepened. Why teach tribal secrets to a white woman who might one day return to her people? But Nijoni silenced these concerns with the authority of her position and the wisdom of her years. "She was broken when she came to us," the old woman told the council one night, unaware that Sarah sat just outside the gathering, understanding enough of their language now to follow the discussion. "The medicine ways are healing her spirit as well as her body, and one day her knowledge may help our people when the white man's diseases come again." Sarah closed her journal silently, tracing her fingers over its cover. What had begun as a record of herbal remedies had become something more, a bridge between worlds, a testament to healing that transcended the barriers of language and culture. And perhaps, though she hardly dared admit it even to herself, the foundation of a new life far from Thomas's controlling grasp. The moon had completed a full cycle since Sarah's arrival at the Apache camp. With each passing day, her movements grew more confident, her Apache vocabulary more extensive, her place in the daily rhythm of tribal life more natural. Though still an outsider, she had found small ways to contribute, assisting with food preparation, helping mind the younger children, and occasionally offering her own medical knowledge when it complemented their practices. One evening, as the cooking fires burned low and most of the tribe had retired to their dwellings, Sarah sat outside her wickiup, writing in her journal by the light of a small oil lamp Gojo had brought her. She looked up to find him approaching, carrying something in his hands. "For you," he said, offering the bundle. "Feet hurt no more." Sarah unwrapped the soft hide to reveal a pair of beautifully crafted moccasins. Unlike the plain functional footwear worn by most tribal members, these were adorned with delicate beadwork in patterns of blue and white. Colors she had once mentioned reminded her of the sky and clouds. "You made these?" she asked, running her fingers over the intricate designs. Gojo nodded, a rare smile softening his weathered features. 3 nights' work. Sarah slipped them on, marveling at how perfectly they fit. Her frontier boots had been wholly unsuitable for desert life, causing constant discomfort. These moved with her feet as though they were a second skin. "Ah, he," she thanked him, the Apache word now coming naturally to her lips. "They're beautiful. Walk with me?" he asked, gesturing toward the stream that flowed past the camp. They strolled in comfortable silence, their path illuminated by moonlight. Sarah found herself studying Gojo's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the quiet dignity in his bearing. At 52, his face carried the maps of experience, yet his movements retained the fluid grace of a man in his prime. "Tell me of your life," she said as they reached a flat boulder overlooking the water. "Before you found me..." Gojo was silent for so long that Sarah thought perhaps he hadn't understood. But when he spoke, his words came carefully, thoughtfully. "I born when Apache still free," he began, his English improving with practice. "As boy I see first white soldiers come, see treaty made, treaty broken, see my people moved like cattle." He described a childhood spent learning the old ways while adapting to a changing world. Unlike many Apache men his age, he had never fought in the wars against white settlers. Instead, his gift for healing had placed him on a different path. "My wife die," he continued softly. "Many winters passed, fever come to camp. I save many, but not her, not my son." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to cover his. "I'm sorry. After, I walk a lone path. Become best tracker, best healer. Teach young ones old ways." He turned to look directly at her. "Until spirits send vision of wounded dove." The implication hung between them, that finding her had somehow changed his solitary journey. Sarah felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest, something she had never experienced with Thomas, not even in the beginning. "I was 17 when I married Thomas," she offered in exchange. "He seemed kind then, successful. My family had lost everything in a bank failure. They saw him as my salvation." A bitter smile crossed her lips. "They never knew what happened when doors closed." "He beat you," Gojo said simply. Not a question. Sarah nodded. "At first, only when he drank, then when business went poorly. Eventually, for any reason or no reason at all. Why stay? Where would I go? He made sure I had no money, no friends, told everyone I was delicate and prone to female hysteria. No one would have believed me." She took a deep breath. "Until that last night, when I knew he would kill me if I stayed." Gojo touched the spot on her temple where the worst cut had been, his fingers gentle against the now healed skin. The gesture held a tenderness that made Sarah's breath catch. "You safe now," he said with quiet certainty. As they walked back toward the camp, a new awareness hummed between them. Recognition of shared pain, mutual respect, and perhaps something more complex that neither was ready to name. Sarah's new moccasins moved silently across the desert soil, leaving no tracks, a fitting symbol for a woman learning to walk a new path, one step at a time. Dawn broke with an unusual commotion in the normally quiet camp. Sarah emerged from her wickiup to find a group of warriors gathered around two young men whose horses bore signs of hard riding. The scouts spoke rapidly in Apache, their gestures conveying urgency even before Sarah could grasp their words. Gojo stood among the tribal leaders, his expression grave as he listened. When he noticed Sarah watching from a distance, he motioned for her to join them, a gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. As she approached, she caught fragments of the conversation. Bilagana, white men, Wiyi, horses, Beyeso, money. The tribal dialect still challenged her, but she understood enough to sense the threat. "What's happening?" she asked Gojo quietly. "White men search desert," he replied, his voice low. 4, maybe 5. One scout say they ask about white woman, show money for information. A cold weight settled in Sarah's stomach. Thomas. It could only be Thomas. The desert should have swallowed her trail, the canyon crossing should have stopped any pursuit, yet somehow he had continued searching. "They approach our hunting grounds," continued one of the scouts in Apache, which Sarah now understood better than she could speak. "They carry rifles and pistols. One wears the star of white man's law." The chief, Naakai Sani, raised his hand for silence. "How far?" 2 days' ride, if they know the way," the scout replied, "but they follow a wrong path. The spirits of the canyon mislead them." A fierce debate erupted among the tribal council. Some argued for immediate relocation of the camp. The summer grounds were nearly depleted of resources anyway, and the planned move to winter quarters could be accelerated. Others favored sending warriors to turn back the intruders before they came closer. Sarah listened, her heart pounding. This danger had come because of her. These people who had sheltered and healed her now faced a threat to their safety and peace. "I should leave," she said to Gojo when there was a pause in the discussion. "Draw them away from your people." Nijoni, who had joined the gathering, shook her head firmly. "Hair," she objected. "Alone in desert you die." "Better than bringing trouble to those who helped me," Sarah insisted. Before the argument could continue, a young warrior approached the circle. In his hand he carried an arrow that had not been crafted by Apache hands. The fletchings were different, the arrowhead shaped in the distinctive style of a neighboring tribe who were not allies. "Found at our eastern boundary," he explained. "A warning." The chief took the arrow, examining it closely. The message was clear. The Apache were not the only ones aware of white men entering tribal territories. If blood was shed, it could trigger wider conflict that would eventually draw in the U.S. cavalry from the fort 60 miles south. Gojo spoke quietly to the chief, who nodded in agreement. "We must know more," Gojo said. "I will track these men, learn their true purpose." "I know their purpose," Sarah said with certainty. "The one who leads them is my husband. He won't stop until he finds me or confirms I'm dead." The chief studied her face. Though they still struggled with language barriers, he had come to respect the quiet strength she had shown during her time with them. "Why does this man hunt you with such hunger?" Sarah hesitated, searching for words that would make sense across cultures. "In his mind, I am his possession. His pride cannot accept that I escaped." The older women in the gathering nodded with grim understanding. Even in their world, such men existed. "We do not give back what was broken to be broken again," the chief said finally, his decision appearing to settle the matter. Yet as the council dispersed and preparations began for either defense or evacuation, Sarah caught concerned glances, directed her way. She had found refuge here, but at what cost to these people? That night, unable to sleep, she sat outside her wickiup, watching the stars. Gojo joined her silently, placing the warning arrow on the ground between them. "He will not take you," Gojo said simply, the quiet certainty in his voice both comforting and frightening. Sarah looked at the arrow, its alien design a symbol of how complex and dangerous the situation had become. What had begun as her personal escape now threatened to ignite conflicts that reached far beyond her own story. For the first time since fleeing Thomas, she faced the possibility that safety might remain forever out of reach, not just for herself, but for anyone who helped her. Dawn found the Apache camp transformed into a hive of disciplined activity. The chief had made his decision during the night council. They would neither flee nor directly confront the intruders. Instead, they would prepare for all possibilities while Gojo led a small party to observe the white men's movements and intentions. Women packed essential items into hide bags, ready for swift departure if necessary. Children were instructed on emergency procedures, which ravines offered the best hiding places, which trails led to secondary camps known only to tribal members. Warriors checked weapons and prepared defensive positions that would remain invisible. Until needed, Sarah worked alongside Nijoni, helping prepare medicine bundles that could be quickly distributed if conflict erupted. Her knowledge of treating gunshot wounds, gained during her midwifery days when hunters sometimes returned, injured, complemented the Apache methods for dealing with arrow and knife injuries. Like this, an older woman named Tunny demonstrated, mixing a powder of crushed herbs with pine resin to create a paste that could stem bleeding and prevent infection. Nearby, her daughter ground dried bark into a pain-relieving tea. Sarah added her own knowledge, showing how clean cloth could be packed into wounds in specific ways. The women worked in solemn concentration, their hands creating healing tools while their minds prepared for violence. As midday approached, Nasha, a warrior's wife, known for her fighting skills, approached Sarah. "Come," she said simply, gesturing toward a clearing where several women had gathered. Sarah followed, curious. Nasha handed her a sturdy wooden staff, then picked up one for herself. Without warning, she swung at Sarah, who barely managed to block the blow. "You must learn," Nasha explained as Sarah recovered her balance. "If white men come, you cannot be helpless." For the next hour, Sarah received a crash course in basic self-defense. The Apache women showed no mercy in their instruction, knocking her down repeatedly, correcting her stance, teaching her how to use her smaller stature to advantage. By the end, Sarah's muscles ached, but she had mastered several moves that might buy precious seconds in a confrontation. "Better," Nasha acknowledged, with the hint of a smile. "Tomorrow, more." As Sarah limped back toward her wickiup, she noticed a group of warriors preparing for departure. Gojo among them, his face decorated with dark red and black pigments that transformed his familiar features into something more forbidding. The war paint was not merely decorative. Each color and pattern held spiritual significance, invoking protection and strength. He saw her watching and approached, his expression softening slightly. "We go now. Watch white men. Return before moon rises. Be careful," Sarah said, the words inadequate for the concern she felt. Gojo touched his medicine pouch. "Spirits watch over us." He hesitated, then added, "If danger comes before we return, go with Nijoni. She knows secret paths." Sarah nodded, though they both knew she would never willingly abandon him. The thought remained unspoken between them as Gojo mounted his horse and departed with 4 other warriors, disappearing like shadows into the surrounding landscape. That evening, unable to sleep, Sarah sat at the edge of camp, her eyes fixed on the direction from which Gojo would return. Nijoni joined her, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders against the desert night's chill. "He is best tracker," the old woman said reassuringly. "Best warrior once, too, before choosing healer's path." "Thomas is dangerous," Sarah replied. "Not just with weapons. He knows how to make people do what he wants, with money, with threats, with charm when needed." Nijoni's weathered hand covered Sarah's. "You fear this man still?" It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "Yes, not just for what he might do to me, but what he might do to anyone who stands between us. The night deepened around them, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering Thomas's face contorted with rage, his cold calculation when plotting against business rivals, his absolute certainty that he owned her body and soul. In her mind, these images contrasted with newer ones, Gojo's. Gentle hands healing her wounds, his quiet strength, the respect with which he treated everyone around him. "I won't go back to him," Sarah whispered half to herself. "I'd rather die in this desert." Nijoni squeezed her hand. "Then we prepare for life instead," she said, with quiet certainty. "Your path leads forward now, not back." As if to emphasize her words, the old woman pressed something into Sarah's palm. A small container of dark pigment, the same war paint Gojo had worn. The symbolism was unmistakable. Whatever came next, Sarah would face it not as a victim, but as a warrior in her own right. Gojo and his scouts returned before dawn, slipping into camp like shadows. The tribal council gathered immediately, warriors and elders crowding into. The chiefs wiki up while Sarah waited anxiously outside. When Gojo finally emerged, his expression told her everything before he spoke a word. "They come," he said simply, "before midday." Thomas had found a guide, a half-Apache man exiled from the tribe years ago for theft, who knew the hidden trails. 4 white men approached, Thomas, the sheriff, and 2 others, all armed, all determined. The camp erupted into final preparations. Children and elders were hidden in caves above the valley. Warriors took positions among rocks and brush. Women, who could fight, armed themselves with knives and bows. Those who couldn't departed with the children. "You should go with them," Gojo told Sarah, but she shook her head. "This is my fight," she replied, her hand touching the small pouch of war paint Nijoni had given her. "I won't hide anymore." The confrontation began, with the sun high overhead. A sentry's bird call signaled the approaching riders. Chief Nakai Sani stood in the center of the camp, flanked by his most respected warriors. Gojo positioned Sarah behind them, partially hidden but present. Thomas Reed rode at the front, his expensive clothes dusty from travel, but his bearing arrogant as ever. Beside him, Sheriff Dawson looked distinctly uncomfortable, his hand nervously touching the silver badge on his chest. Behind them came Martinez the Tracker and Blackwood the Bounty Hunter, both scanning the surroundings with professional wariness. "We come for the white woman," Thomas announced without preamble, his voice carrying across the clearing. "My wife was injured and confused when she wandered into your territory. I'm prepared to compensate you for any trouble she's caused." He held up a bag that clinked with the sound of coins. The insulting implication that the Apache had kidnapped Sarah or were holding her for ransom hung in the air like gunpowder waiting for a spark. The chief remained impassive. "We know no such woman," he replied in carefully accented English. Thomas's face hardened. "Don't play games with me, old man. My tracker followed her trail here." He turned to the sheriff. "Tell them, Dawson, tell them the law requires them to return my wife." The sheriff cleared his throat, clearly reluctant. "Now, Thomas, let's handle this diplomatically. These folks ain't obligated to—" "Show them your badge," Thomas interrupted sharply. "Remind them what happens to Indians who defy territorial law." Dawson fingered his silver star, its polished surface catching the sunlight. "The law says a husband has rights to his wife," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "But it don't say we can go searching through private dwellings on Indian land." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "She's here! I know she's here!" Sarah stepped forward then, moving past the warriors to stand beside the chief. She had applied the war paint in simple lines across her cheekbones, not trying to imitate Apache designs, but creating her own symbol of resistance. The bruises had faded from her face, and she stood straighter than Thomas had ever allowed. In her Apache dress, with her skin tanned by desert sun, she looked almost like a different woman. "Hello, Thomas," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Thomas's expression shifted from surprise to triumph to rage in the space of seconds. "Sarah," he said, his tone dangerously controlled, "you've put me through quite an ordeal. It's time to come home." "I am home," she replied. Thomas's laugh was brittle. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. Look at you, dressed like a savage, living in filth. Whatever fantasy you're playing out ends now." He turned to the sheriff. "You see, she's clearly not in her right mind. That head injury I told you about has confused her." Sarah addressed the sheriff directly. "There was no head injury, Sheriff Dawson, except the ones Thomas gave me with his fists. For 18 years, I've hidden bruises and made excuses. I won't do it anymore." The sheriff's gaze moved between Sarah's resolute face and Thomas's barely contained fury. Doubt crept into his expression. "These people saved my life," Sarah continued. "I'm staying with them of my own free will. She's my wife." Thomas snarled, his carefully maintained public persona cracking. "The law says she belongs to me." His hand moved toward his holstered pistol, and instantly every Apache warrior had an arrow nocked and aimed. The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge, with Sarah standing at its center. No longer a possession to be claimed, but the pivot point upon which everything would turn. Sheriff Dawson broke the deadly tension, moving his horse between Thomas and the warriors. "Lower your hand, Thomas," he ordered. "No one's dying here today." Thomas's fingers hovered near his pistol, his eyes never leaving Sarah. "She's confused, Sheriff. These savages have filled her head with nonsense." "I'm seeing clearly for the first time," Sarah countered. The war paint on her cheeks felt like armor, giving her strength to stand her ground. The sheriff studied Sarah's face, noting her clear eyes and steady voice. This wasn't a confused or injured woman, but someone making a deliberate choice. He'd had his suspicions about Reed for years. The way his first wife had died suddenly, how Sarah rarely appeared in town without him. Those moments when he'd glimpsed fear in her eyes. "The lady says she's staying," Dawson said finally. "That's good enough for me." Thomas's face contorted with rage. "You work for me, Dawson. Half the town works for me. You do as I say." The sheriff's hand moved to his own weapon. "I work for the law, Thomas. Always have." With a roar of frustration, Thomas drew his pistol. Before he could aim, the sheriff grabbed his arm, forcing it upward. The shot went wide, but it was enough to shatter the standoff. Blackwood and Martinez dove from their horses, seeking cover. As Apache arrows whistled through the air, the sheriff struggled with Thomas, both men tumbling from horseback into the dust. "Get back!" Gojo shouted, pulling Sarah toward the nearest wickiup as bullets began to fly. The Apache warriors melted into their prepared positions, using the terrain they knew intimately. Their discipline was perfect. No wasted movements, no unnecessary risks. This was not their first battle against armed white men. From their position behind the wickiup, Sarah and Gózhå could see fragments of the chaotic scene. Blackwood had taken cover behind a boulder, firing methodically at any movement. Martinez seemed more interested in retreat than combat, working his way back toward the horses. The sheriff and Thomas were still grappling on the ground, neither able to use their weapons effectively. A child's cry pierced the gunfire. One of the younger boys had not retreated with the others, and now stood frozen in the open, paralyzed by fear as bullets struck the ground nearby. Without hesitation, Sarah broke from cover, running in a low crouch toward the child. Gózhå's shout of warning followed her, but she didn't slow. Reaching the boy, she scooped him into her arms and turned back toward safety. Blackwood swung his rifle toward the movement, finger tightening on the trigger. Only at the last second did he register that his target was a woman carrying a child. He jerked the barrel upward, the bullet harmlessly striking a tree instead. That moment of humanity cost him. An Apache arrow found its mark in his shoulder, not a killing shot, but enough to take him out of the fight. He dropped his rifle, cursing as he clutched the wound. Sarah delivered the child to waiting hands, then turned back toward the battle. The chief had engaged Martinez, who was proving surprisingly skilled with a knife. Thomas had finally broken. free from the sheriff, and was now backing toward the horses, firing wildly to cover his retreat. Gózhŭ moved to intercept him, weaving between bullet impacts with the grace of a man half his age. Thomas saw him coming and took more careful. No! Sarah screamed, running toward them. Thomas's head turned at the sound of her voice, his concentration broken for a crucial second. It was enough for Gózhŭ to close the distance. The two men collided, Thomas's gun discharging harmlessly into the ground as they fell. They rolled in the dust, Thomas's city-bred strength against Gózhŭ's lifetime of desert survival. For a moment, Thomas gained the upper hand, pinning the older man beneath him. He reached for a knife at his belt, raising it for a killing blow. Sarah grabbed a fallen branch and swung with all her might. The wood connected with Thomas's temple, sending him sprawling. His silver pocket watch, a prized possession he never went without, flew from his vest, landing in the dirt. The impact cracked its face, the hands freezing at 6:17 as a stray bullet struck it moments later. Gózhŭ was on his feet instantly, pulling Sarah behind him as Thomas struggled to rise, blood streaming from his head wound. "You're dead," Thomas snarled, lurching toward them. "Both of you!" The sheriff's voice cut through the chaos. "That's enough." He stood with his pistol aimed steadily at Thomas's chest. "Drop the knife, Reed. It's over." Thomas looked around wildly. Martinez had surrendered, kneeling with his hands raised. Blackwood sat propped against a rock, the fight gone from him. The Apache warriors had them completely surrounded, arrows nocked and aimed. The sun hung low on the horizon, bathing the scene in blood-red light, as Thomas Reed finally realized he had lost. Thomas's surrender was anything but graceful. Even with the sheriff's gun trained on him and Apache arrows ready to fly, his eyes burned with murderous rage. "This isn't over," he spat, directing his venom toward Sarah. "You think you can humiliate me like this? You're nothing without me." "Nothing! Shut your mouth, Reed!" Sheriff Dawson ordered, producing handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for assault and attempted murder." As the sheriff moved to restrain him, Thomas made one final desperate lunge. Not toward Sarah, but toward Gózhŭ. The knife he had concealed in his sleeve flashed in the dying sunlight as he drove it toward the Apache's chest. Gózhŭ reacted with decades of warrior's instinct, twisting to avoid the fatal strike. The blade sliced across his upper arm instead, opening a deep gash that immediately soaked his shirt with blood. The sheriff's gun butt cracked against Thomas's skull before he could strike again, dropping him unconscious to the dust. The Apache warriors surged forward, only the chief's raised hand preventing them from ending Thomas's life on the spot. "Gózhŭ!" Sarah cried, rushing to his side as he pressed his hand against the wound. Blood seeped between his fingers, alarmingly bright against his skin. "Not deep," he assured her, though his complexion had already paled. "Small cut." Sarah knew better. She'd seen enough knife wounds during her midwifery days to recognize a serious injury. "I need my medicine bag," she told the nearest warrior, who sprinted toward her wickiup. As she guided Gózhŭ to sit against a boulder, the full reality of what had just happened crashed over her. Thomas had tried to kill a man, would have succeeded if not for Gózhŭ's reflexes. The husband she had once vowed to honor would have become a murderer before her eyes. The medicine bag arrived, and Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency. She cut away the blood-soaked sleeve, revealing the full extent of the wound, a 6-inch gash that had sliced through muscle, but miraculously missed the major artery. "Hold him," she instructed two warriors, who steadied Gózhŭ's arm as she cleaned the wound with a mixture of water and herbs Nijoni had taught her to use. Gózhŭ remained stoic, his only reaction a slight tightening around his eyes. From her bag, Sarah produced a bone needle and sinew thread prepared for such emergencies. "This will hurt," she warned him in Apache. "I trust your hands," he replied, his gaze never leaving her face. As Sarah sewed the wound closed with neat, precise stitches, the sheriff supervised his prisoners. Thomas had regained consciousness, subdued now with hands cuffed behind his back. Martinez and Blackwood also, restrained, sat nearby under guard. The bounty hunter's shoulder had been hastily bandaged, his face gray with pain. I'll take them back to Copper Springs, Dawson told the chief. Reed will stand trial for attempted murder. The territorial judge arrives next week. Will your white man's law truly punish him? The chief asked, skepticism evident in his tone. The sheriff's jaw tightened. I'll see to it personally. What he tried to do here, and what he did to his wife all these years, it won't be ignored. Not anymore. Sarah finished bandaging Gojo's arm, her hands now steady, though her heart raced with lingering fear. The white fabric quickly showed spots of red where blood seeped through, but the bleeding had slowed. If infection could be prevented, he would heal. You need rest, she told him, and medicine tea for the pain. Gojo touched her cheek with his good hand, leaving a faint smudge of his blood alongside her war paint. You fight well, he said, softly. Brave woman. Their eyes held for a long moment, something profound and unspoken passing between them. Around them, the Apache began tending to minor injuries and repairing damage from the brief but intense fight. The chief directed warriors to help the sheriff prepare for departing with his prisoners. Thomas watched Sarah from where he sat restrained, his expression shifting between hatred and disbelief. The woman tending the Apache warrior with such confidence bore little resemblance to the cowed wife he had dominated for 18 years. His control over her had been absolute. Until it wasn't. As night fell, fires were lit around the camp. Sarah sat vigil beside Gojo's sleeping form, applying cool compresses to his forehead when fever threatened and checking his bandages hourly. The blood-stained shirt she had cut from him lay nearby, a stark reminder of how close she had come to losing him. The sheriff approached before departing, his expression solemn. We'll leave at first light, he said. Will you return with us to testify against him? Sarah looked down at Gózhǫ, then around at the camp that had become her sanctuary. My place is here now, she answered, but I'll write my testimony. In for the judge. Dawson nodded, understanding in his eyes. You found something better than justice here, didn't you? Sarah didn't need to answer. As the sheriff walked away, she turned her attention back to Gózhǫ, whose eyes had opened, clear and aware despite his injury. I stay, she told him in his language, the simple phrase carrying the weight of a lifetime's decision. Dawn arrived with the departure of Sheriff Dawson and his prisoners. Thomas had spent his final moments in the camp hurling threats and promises of return until the sheriff gagged him with a bandana. As the dust from their horses settled, a palpable relief spread through the Apache community. Gojo's condition had stabilized through the night, thanks to Sarah's vigilant care. The fever that had threatened briefly had broken before midnight, and though weakness from blood loss left him pale, infection had not taken hold. Word arrived from a scout that the prisoners and sheriff had successfully crossed the canyon, effectively removing the immediate threat. The tribal council called for a healing ceremony, not just for Gojo's physical wound, but for the spiritual wounds the confrontation had inflicted on the entire community. As the sun reached its zenith, the tribe gathered in a wide circle, around a central fire. Gojo sat propped against cushions, his injured arm carefully bound, but his spirit alert. The tribal medicine men had spent the morning preparing special herbs and paints for the ritual. Nijoni approached Sarah, who had finally allowed herself a brief rest after her night-long vigil. You come, the old woman said. Join circle. Sarah hesitated. I'm not Apache. You fought for us, Nijoni replied simply. Healed our healer. Circle needs your strength. The elderly woman led Sarah to a position in the circle directly across from Gózhǫ. As the drums began, soft at first, then building in intensity, the chief stepped into the center. His ceremonial regalia caught the sunlight, feathers, beads, and shells that represented the elements and spirits of their world. He spoke in Apache, his words rhythmic and formal. Though Sarah couldn't understand everything, she recognized references to balance, healing, and protection. 4 medicine men joined him, each representing a cardinal direction, each carrying vessels of sacred materials, water from hidden springs, earth from ancestral grounds, smoke from specific woods, pigments from minerals found only in secret places. To Sarah's surprise, the chief gestured for her to enter the circle. When she hesitated, Nijoni gave her a gentle push forward. "What should I do?" Sarah whispered. "Follow heart," came the soft reply. Standing before the entire tribe, Sarah felt their collective gaze. Not so long ago, such attention would have terrified her. Thomas had trained her to be invisible, to speak only when spoken to. Now she drew strength from their witness. The chief presented her with a small clay bowl containing a mixture of medicinal herbs. She recognized most from her training with the tribal healers: plants for cleansing wounds, fighting infection, restoring strength. With a nod of encouragement from the chief, she understood her role. Sarah knelt beside Gojo. With careful hands, she unwrapped his bandage, exposing the wound to the healing air and sunlight. The stitches she had placed held firm, the edges of the cut already showing signs of knitting together. She applied the medicine from the bowl, her movements deliberate and gentle. Though many in the tribe had greater knowledge of healing ways, this moment acknowledged her place among them, not just as a guest, but as someone who had earned the right to care for one of their most respected members. Gojo's eyes held hers as she worked, his expression conveying what words between them had not yet said. When she finished, he took her hand in his, pressing it against his heart in a gesture that needed no translation. The ceremony continued as the medicine men moved through specific rituals, burning sacred herbs, chanting ancient songs, creating a healing energy that seemed to pulse through the gathered community. Sarah remained beside Gojo, their connection forming a tangible current within the larger circle. As the ceremony reached its conclusion, the women of the tribe came forward, one by one, each adding a thread to a small loom that had been set up near the fire. Some threads were dyed with traditional pigments, others were colored with trading post dyes, a few were pulled from Sarah's original tattered dress. Together they formed the beginning of a unity bracelet, a visible symbol that something new was being created from elements of both worlds. Nijoni tied the partially completed bracelet around Sarah's wrist. "Not finished," she explained. "Grows as you grow with us." The message was clear. Sarah's integration into the tribe was neither complete nor guaranteed, but a process that would continue to evolve. The bracelet would be added to as she earned her place, one thread at a time. As the ceremonial fire was allowed to burn down, several tribal members approached Sarah with newfound respect in their eyes. Even those who had been most suspicious of her presence now acknowledged her actions during the confrontation. She had risked her life for an Apache child. She had struck her own husband to protect Gojo. She had chosen their world over returning to her own. "You are Kinwani now," one of the elder women told her, bestowing a name that meant strong one in their language. Others nodded in agreement, the names spreading through the gathering like ripples in still water. Sarah touched the unity bracelet on her wrist, feeling its weight, not as a shackle like her marriage had been, but as an anchor to this new life she had found. 2 months passed, the desert cooling as summer yielded to autumn. The tribe had moved to their fall hunting grounds, a sheltered valley with better protection from winter winds. Gojo's wound had healed completely, leaving only a proud scar that Sarah sometimes traced with her fingertips when they sat together in the evenings. Word had reached the camp through traders that Thomas Reed had been convicted and sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. The evidence against him had been overwhelming, not just Sarah's written testimony, but the sheriff's eyewitness account of his attempted murder and surprising testimonies from townspeople who had long suspected but never spoken about his violence. "Will you see him?" Gojo asked, as they walked along the stream that bordered the camp. Their language barrier had diminished. He spoke more English, while she had become increasingly fluent in Apache. Sarah considered the question carefully. Yes, she decided, one last time to end things properly. The journey to Copper Springs took 3 days, Gojo accompanying her despite the tribe's concerns about a white woman and Apache man traveling together through hostile territory. They arrived as the town prepared for its harvest festival, the streets busier than usual with farmers and ranchers. Sarah drew curious stares in her Apache dress, her skin now bronzed by desert sun, her bearing no longer that of the timid Mrs. Reed. Most didn't recognize her until she spoke. Some turned away, embarrassed by their years of silent complicity with her abuse. Others nodded respectfully, acknowledging the courage of her escape and testimony. Sheriff Dawson escorted them to the jailhouse, where Thomas awaited transfer to the territorial prison. 5 minutes, he told them, unlocking the cell door. That's all I can give you. Thomas sat on his cot, diminished by confinement. His once immaculate clothes hung loosely on his frame, his imperious manner deflated by defeat. When he looked up and saw Sarah, hatred flickered briefly in his eyes before, settling into cold calculation. "Come to gloat?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. "No," Sarah replied calmly. "I came to forgive you." Thomas laughed bitterly. "I don't want your forgiveness. It's not for you," she said. "It's for me. To finally be free of you, I need to let go of everything, the fear, the anger, even the hatred. So I forgive you, Thomas, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." His eyes narrowed as he noticed Gojo standing protectively behind her. "So it's true. You've gone native." He spat the words like poison. "Threw away civilization for a savage." Sarah didn't rise to the bait. "I found kindness, respect, and healing among people you call savages. What does that say about the civilization you're so proud of?" She reached into her pouch and withdrew the bent wedding ring she had carried since her escape. Placing it on the small table between them, she added a folded document, divorce papers the sheriff had helped her obtain. "Sign these," she said. "It changes nothing about your sentence, but it gives us both a clean end." Thomas stared at the papers, then at the ring. For a moment, something almost like regret crossed his features. "We could have had everything," he said quietly. "No." Sarah corrected him. "You wanted everything, including owning me. That's not a marriage. That's not love." When they left the jailhouse, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Whether Thomas signed the papers or not, she had said her goodbye to that life. The divorce was a formality. In her heart, she had been free since the day she fled into the desert. Their return journey took them past the canyon where they had first met. By mutual agreement, they stopped at its edge as the sun began to set. From his medicine pouch, Gojo produced a small carved wooden box inlaid with turquoise. "In my tribe," he explained, "when two people join their paths, they bring together earth from places important to their journey." Opening the box, he showed her 2 compartments, one containing soil from near the Copper Springs Church, where Sarah had once prayed for deliverance, the other holding earth from the sacred cave where he had first tended her wounds. Following Apache tradition adapted for their unique circumstances, they mixed the soils together while speaking words of commitment. No witnesses were needed beyond the canyon spirits and desert sky. Their vows were simple: protection, respect, partnership, and love. As the last light painted the canyon walls in gold and crimson, they stood together at the place where their paths had first crossed. Sarah, now Kinwani to her adopted people, looked out over the vast landscape that had nearly claimed her life and instead had given her a new one. "Where will we go now?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Gojo smiled, taking her hand in his. "Home," he said simply. They made their way to the hidden springs where Sarah had first begun to heal. The water reflected the evening stars as they approached its edge. No longer places of desperate escape or tentative recovery, these landmarks had transformed into the foundation of their shared story. Sarah knelt to touch the clear water, remembering the frightened woman who had bathed here months before. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who had found her strength in the harshest of crucibles. Looking up at Gojo, she saw her future reflected in his eyes. A future neither of them could have imagined before a desperate flight into the desert had brought their worlds together.